If you really want to know the truth, most families are just corporations with better PR. They talk about loyalty, but the second you threaten their bank account, you realize blood is actually pretty cheap. It kills me the way they smile while holding the knife. I am Rose Peterson, and I found out my parents were the biggest phonies of them all. They murdered a majestic oak tree just so my brother could get a tan, then expected me to lie to a judge to save them. It was depressing as hell. Before I tell you how I fixed it, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spend here with us. Now let me tell you about the silence before the fall. There is a specific kind of silence that exists only 300 feet up in the canopy of an old-growth forest. It is not the absence of sound, but the presence of history up here, anchored by a climbing rope and a friction hitch to the trunk of a 600-year-old Douglas fir. The world simplifies. The air smells of resin-damp moss, and the clean, sharp scent of pine needles baking in the filtered sunlight. I ran my gloved hand over the bark, feeling the deep, rugged furrows that were older than the United States Constitution. This tree had survived fires, droughts, windstorms, and beetle infestations. It stood because it had integrity. Its roots were deep, its core was solid, and it didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. As a certified master arborist, my job was to listen to what the trees were saying, to read the language written in their leaves and cambium layers. Humans lie. They twist narratives to suit their egos. Trees, however, are incapable of deceit. If a tree is rotting, it shows you the fungus. If it is thriving, it shows you the crown. I preferred trees. My meditative state was shattered by the harsh vibrating buzz of my cell phone in my chest pocket. The sudden noise sent a flock of Steller's jays scattering from the branches above their blue wings, flashing in the dappled light. I frowned, adjusting my harness. Very few people had this number, and even fewer would dare call me when they knew I was on a job site in the middle of the Cascade foothills. I pulled the phone out, checking the screen. The name displayed made my stomach tighten, a cold knot forming that had nothing to do with the altitude. Mom. I let it go to voicemail. I needed to finish my assessment of the fir's upper leader before I dealt with whatever catastrophe was brewing back in suburbia, but the phone buzzed again immediately, and then a third time. The persistence was typical of frantic demand for attention that refused to acknowledge my schedule or my boundaries. I sighed, clipped my safety line to a secondary anchor, and pressed the phone to my ear. Before I could even say hello, the voicemail notification pinged. I listened to the message first. Rose, pick up. Pick up right now. It's an emergency. A disaster. We need you. Kyle is... Just pick up. Her voice was shrill, pitching up into that hysterical register she reserved for minor inconveniences that she viewed as Greek tragedies. But the mention of Kyle, my brother, triggered a reflexive flinch. It wasn't concern for his safety. It was the learned expectation of collateral damage. That name, spoken in that tone, was a time machine. Suddenly, I wasn't suspended in a majestic fir tree in Washington state. I was 24 years old again, sitting in a folding chair in a humid university gymnasium wearing a cap and gown that cost me a week's wages. It was my graduation day from the forestry program. I had graduated magna cum laude, a distinction I had worked 2 jobs to achieve. I looked at the section of bleachers where the families were seated, clutching my diploma cover, searching for my parents. The seats I had reserved for them were empty. I remembered checking my phone that day, 5 years ago, finding a text message from my father. Kyle had an accident. We're at the urgent care. Can't make it. Panic had seized me. Then, I thought he'd been in a car crash. I rushed out of the ceremony without saying goodbye to my professors, driving 3 hours home in my graduation gown, my heart hammering. When I arrived, I found Kyle sitting on the couch with an ice pack on his ankle and a beer in his hand. He hadn't been in a wreck. He had decided, in a fit of weekend warrior confidence, to cut down a 40-foot pine tree in his backyard because he didn't want to pay a professional $800 to do it. He had used a dull chainsaw, made the wrong cut, and dropped the tree directly onto his own privacy fence, crushing it. In the panic to run away from the falling timber, he'd twisted his ankle. My parents weren't at my graduation because they were busy soothing Kyle's ego and icing his foot, telling him it wasn't his fault that the wind must have taken it. They had skipped the celebration of my 4-year degree to help my brother clean up a mess made by his own cheapness and incompetence. That was the trigger point. That was the moment I realized that in the ecosystem of the Peterson family, I was the nurse log expected to decay so Kyle could grow taller. I left the next morning and rarely looked back. Bringing myself back to the present, I looked at the solid wood of the Douglas fir, drawing strength from it. I dialed my mother back. "I'm working, Mom. Is everyone alive? Is the house on fire?" "Rose, oh, thank God," she gasped, skipping over any pleasantries or inquiries about my life. "You have to come home. Immediately. We are being sued. They're trying to ruin us." "Who is suing you?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "Did Kyle hit someone with his car?" "No, it's the neighbor. That wretched woman, Mrs. Gable. She's suing us for $50,000. Rose, 50,000. Can you believe the greed?" I paused. Mrs. Gable, I remembered her clearly. She was the quiet widow next door who spent her days tending to her hydrangeas. When my parents forgot my 16th birthday because Kyle had a hockey tournament, Mrs. Gable had left a card in our mailbox with a $20 bill and a handwritten note telling me I was smart and capable. "Mrs. Gable is suing you. Why?" "It's about that tree," my mother said, her voice dripping with indignation. "The big oak on the side of the house. You know, the one that blocks all the light to the deck Kyle likes to use. It was dropping leaves everywhere, making a mess. Kyle said it was dangerous. He said it looked like it was going to fall on the house any minute. So we did the responsible thing. We had it removed." My grip on the safety line tightened. "You removed a mature oak tree. Was it on your property?" "It was on the line," she said quickly, too quickly. "Basically ours. Kyle found a guy who would do it cheap cash under the table. They took it down yesterday. And now she's slapped us with a lawsuit claiming it was her tree and that it was a historic specimen or some nonsense. She wants $50,000 for damages. It's extortion." "Mom," I said, closing my eyes, "if the trunk was even partially on her land, you can't just cut it down. That's timber trespass. And if it was a mature oak—" "It was diseased," she interrupted, shouting now. "Kyle said it was rotten inside, totally hollow. We did her a favor, but our lawyer says we need proof. We need an expert witness to sign an affidavit stating the tree was a hazard and had to come down immediately for safety reasons. If we have that, the judge will throw the case out." "So," I said, the realization settling over me like a cold fog, "you don't want me to come home to visit. You want me to come home because I'm a certified master arborist. We need you to inspect the stump," she said, her tone shifting from hysterical to demanding. "You have the credentials. You come down here, look at the stump, write up a report saying it was sick, and this whole thing goes away. Family helps family, Rose. You owe us that much after we paid for your braces." I looked out at the endless green horizon of the forest. They wanted me to use my license, the reputation I had built with years of sweat and study, to cover up another one of Kyle's mistakes. They wanted me to lie for them. They didn't care about the tree. They didn't care about the law. And they certainly didn't care about Mrs. Gable. They just needed a signature. "I'll come," I said, my voice eerily calm. "Good," she breathed, relieved. "We'll see you tomorrow. Don't be late." She hung up without saying, "I love you." I stared at the phone for a long moment before slipping it back into my pocket. I would go home. I would inspect the stump. But I wasn't going there to save them. I was going there to speak for the tree. The drive to my childhood home was a regression in real time. With every mile marker that passed on the interstate, I felt the phantom weight of old insecurities settling on my shoulders like wet snow. I turned off the main highway and wound through the manicured subdivisions, passing lawns that were chemically green and devoid of biodiversity, a stark contrast to the chaotic, vibrant life of the forest I had left behind. When I finally pulled into the driveway of the colonial-style house where I grew up, my eyes didn't go to the front door or the new Lexus parked in the garage. They went immediately to the side yard. It looked like a crime scene. Where a majestic canopy should have been filtering the afternoon light, there was a harsh, blinding gap of empty sky. The ground was covered in a violent spray of sawdust, bright and raw against the dark mulch. And there, in the center of the devastation, sat the stump. It was massive, easily 4 feet in diameter, a jagged, ugly wound in the earth that seemed to pulse with the trauma of its sudden amputation. I turned off the ignition, my hands trembling slightly on the wheel, not from fear, but from a simmering volcanic anger. I stepped out of my truck, my boots crunching on the gravel. Before I could even reach the stump, the front door swung open, and Kyle stepped out. He was wearing aviator sunglasses and holding a craft beer, looking every bit the leisure-class prince he aspired to be. He didn't look worried. He looked annoyed, as if my arrival was a service appointment that was running late. "Finally," he called out, sauntering down the steps. "The tree hugger returns. Took you long enough, Rose. Mom's losing her mind inside." He didn't offer a hug or a hello. He gestured vaguely at the stump with his beer bottle. "Ugly beast, isn't it glad it's gone? The shade was making the pool water too cold until July. I told Mom and Dad it had to go so we could actually enjoy the deck." I stared at him, blinking slowly. "You cut down a 100-year-old oak because your pool was chilly." Kyle laughed, a dismissive, grating sound. "Don't start with the Lorax speech. It was dangerous. It was dropping branches. Besides, look at the view now." He swept his arm toward the neighbor's house, which was now fully visible, stripping away any privacy both families had previously enjoyed. "Anyway, the neighbor is being a total psycho about it, suing us for 50 grand. Can you believe that? For a tree, it's just wood, Rose. It grows back." "Not in your lifetime," I muttered, walking past him toward the stump. "Hey," he said, following me, his tone sharpening. "Just get in there, poke it with your little stick or whatever, and write the paper saying it was rotten. Dad's stress levels are through the roof, and that means my allowance for the renovation project is on hold. I need this lawsuit gone by Friday." He took a sip of his beer, leaning against the side of the house. "You're the expert, right, glorified gardener or whatever? Fix it." I ignored him, kneeling beside the stump. The smell of fresh oak tannin was overwhelming, a sharp, acidic scent that I usually associated with lumber mills, not residential lawns. I ran my hand over the cut surface. It was jagged, clearly done by an amateur or someone rushing to finish a job before anyone could stop them. I needed to see the other side. I stood up and walked toward the property line. "Where are you going?" Kyle called out. "Don't talk to her." The lawyer said no contact. I kept walking. I crossed the invisible line that separated my parents' manicured sod from the lush cottage-style garden next door. I walked up the flagstone path to the small porch where Mrs. Gable sat in a wicker chair. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her silver hair was thin, and her hands, usually busy with knitting or trowels, were still in her lap. When she saw me, her eyes widened, and for a second I saw fear. She thought I was there to bully her, just like my parents probably had. "Mrs. Gable?" I said softly. "It's Rose, from next door." Her expression softened, crumbling into a heartbreaking mix of relief and grief. "Rose," she whispered. She stood up shakily, reaching out to take my hands. Her skin was like papyrus. "I'm so sorry, Rose. I didn't want to cause trouble." But they just cut it. I went inside to make tea, and I heard the chainsaws. By the time I got out, the main leader was already on the ground. Tears welled in her eyes. "Henry planted that tree the week we moved in. It was 1958. We buried our first dog under that tree. We sat under it during the heat wave of 95. It wasn't just a tree, Rose. It was him." My chest tightened. This wasn't a cash grab. This was desecration. My parents and Kyle viewed the world as a series of commodities, views to be consumed, assets to be leveraged, inconveniences to be removed. Mrs. Gable viewed the world as a relationship. "I know," I said, squeezing her hands. "I know. They say it was sick," she said, her voice trembling with indignation. "Your father screamed at me over the fence. He said it was a rotten hazard, and he did me a favor. But it wasn't sick, Rose. It was strong. I talked to it every morning. I'm going to find out the truth," I promised her. "I'm going to inspect it now." I left her on the porch and returned to the stump. Kyle was gone, likely bored having retreated back into the air conditioning. I opened my field kit. I didn't need the resistograph to tell me the density, but I used it anyway to create a data trail. I drilled a microbit into the heartwood. The needle barely moved. The wood was dense hard and incredibly sound. There was no discoloration, no spongy texture indicating fungal decay, no hollows from carpenter ants. I counted the rings using a magnifying loupe. The growth was consistent and vigorous. I counted back 108 years. This tree had germinated before World War I. It had survived the Great Depression, the invention of the internet, and decades of storms. It was a Quercus alba, a white oak, a species known for its resilience. It was in peak biological health. It would have stood for another century easily. My parents had murdered a living monument because Kyle wanted a tan. I packed my kit, my movements sharp and angry. I took several high-resolution photos of the stump, the lack of rot, and the sawdust. I collected a core sample, sealing it in a plastic tube and labeling it with the date and time. This was my evidence. I walked into the house. My mother and father were at the kitchen table, papers strewn everywhere. Kyle was leaning against the counter, scrolling on his phone. When I entered, the atmosphere shifted. They looked at me with expectant, hungry eyes. "Well?" my father asked, his voice booming. He was a large man who used volume as a weapon. "Did you find the rot?" "The guy who cut it said the center looked iffy." "That's enough, right?" "Just right that the center was compromised." "The guy who cut it was lying to get paid," I said, placing the core sample on the table. The plastic tube clattered loudly against the granite. The tree was a white oak. It was 108 years old. I just tested the hardness and the cellular structure. There is zero decay, not even early-stage rot. That tree was healthier than half the people in this town. The room went silent. Then the explosion happened. "What are you talking about?" My mother shrieked, standing up. "You're supposed to be on our side. We didn't fly you down here to tell us the tree was healthy." "I drove," I corrected her calmly. "And I'm telling you the truth. You cut down a pristine tree on a property line. That's illegal." "It's not illegal if you say it was dangerous," Kyle shouted, pushing off the counter. He walked toward me, using his height to intimidate. "Just sign the paper, Rose. Who cares? It's already gone. Mrs. Gable is practically senile. She won't know the difference. Just write the report that says it had, I don't know, termites or something." "That's perjury," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "And fraud." "Oh, don't give me that high and mighty attitude," my father snapped. "After everything we've done for you, we paid for your college, we paid for your braces, we let you live here rent-free for a summer. You owe us." "This is how the real world works, Rose. You help your family. You don't side with the neighbor over your own flesh and blood." "The real world involves consequences," I said. "You destroyed something you didn't own." "We're not paying that old bat $50,000, my mother yelled, slamming her hand on the table. "We don't have the liquidity right now, not with the market the way it is. If we lose this lawsuit, we might have to sell the lake house. Is that what you want?" "You want to take away our vacation home because of a stupid piece of wood." "The lake house," I repeated flatly. That was Kyle's playground. He spent every summer there throwing parties. "So, let me get this straight. You want me to risk my professional license, commit perjury, and defraud a grieving widow so Kyle doesn't lose his party pad?" "It's for the family," my father roared. "You represent this family. If you go in there and say the tree was healthy, you are betraying us. We will cut you off, Rose. I mean it. No inheritance. No Christmas. You'll be dead to us." The threat hung in the air, heavy and toxic. They were leveraging their love, or what passed for it, as currency to buy my integrity. I looked at Kyle, who was smirking, confident that the threat of exile would bring me to heel. I looked at my mother, whose face was twisted with entitlement. They truly believed they owned me, just like they thought they owned the sunlight and the view. I picked up my field kit. I looked at the core sample on the table, the undeniable proof of the tree's life. I didn't pick it up. I left it there right in front of them. "Fine," I said. my voice dropping to a register so low they had to lean in to hear it. I kept my face blank, masking the fury burning behind my ribs. If you want an expert witness, you'll get one. My father exhaled a massive puff of relief. He mistook my resignation for submission. He clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder, smiling. Good girl, I knew you'd come around. Just tell the lawyer what he needs to hear. I'll see you in court, I said. I walked out the back door before they could see the look in my eyes. They thought, see you in court was a promise of support. They didn't realize it was a declaration of war. I walked back to my truck, my hands steady now. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was a witness, and the tree was going to have its day. The county courthouse was a building that tried very hard to look majestic, but mostly smelled of floor wax, stale coffee, and anxiety. The courtroom itself was lined with wood paneling, but it wasn't the honest, solid timber of a craftsman's home. It was a thin, cheap veneer glued over particle board, pretending to be walnut. I sat in the back row, initially running my hand over the bench in front of me, feeling the artificial smoothness of the varnish. It felt fake. It felt like this entire proceeding. My parents were seated at the defense table, looking the picture of aggrieved suburban dignity. My father wore his best navy suit, the one he usually reserved for weddings and funerals, and my mother was dabbing at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. Beside them sat their lawyer, Mr. Sterling. He was a man who clearly billed by the minute with a suit that cost more than Mrs. Gable's car, and a smile that didn't reach his predatory eyes. Kyle was in the gallery a few rows ahead of me, slouching, checking his watch and occasionally shooting dirty looks across the aisle. On the plaintiff's side sat Mrs. Gable. She looked terrifyingly small in the high-backed oak chair. She was wearing a floral dress that I recognized from church services 10 years ago, and she was clutching her handbag with white-knuckled desperation. Her lawyer was a local general practitioner, a man with scuffed shoes and a messy briefcase, who looked like he spent more time drafting wills than fighting litigious sharks like Sterling. The disparity in power was nauseating. My parents had money aggression and a slick attorney. Mrs. Gable had the truth, but in a room built on arguments rather than facts, truth is often the first casualty. All rise, the bailiff intoned, and Judge Holloway entered. He was an older man with a face like a dried apple doll and eyes that were sharp and impatient. He looked like a man who had heard every lie in the county and had no patience for any of them. The proceedings began with the predictable theatrics. Mrs. Gable's lawyer stumbled through his opening statement, talking about property rights and sentimental value. Sterling, in contrast, was smooth and lethal. He painted Mrs. Gable as a confused elderly woman who was impeding the necessary maintenance of a property. He spoke of hazardous vegetation and the burden of safety. He used words like negligence to describe Mrs. Gable's refusal to cut the tree, turning the victim into the villain. Kyle snickered when Sterling described the tree as a rotting nuisance. Then it was time for the defense to present its case. Sterling stood up, buttoning his jacket with a flourish. Your Honor, the defense calls Ms. Rose Peterson to the stand. A ripple of whispers went through the room. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer. I saw my parents turn to look at me. My mother gave me a tight, encouraging nod, her eyes pleading, do the right thing. My father just stared, a heavy, expectant look that said, remember who pays the bills. Kyle gave me a thumbs up, smirking. They were so confident. They thought they had bought my testimony with guilt and intimidation. They thought blood was thicker than water, and certainly thicker than sap. I walked to the witness stand, placed my hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. As I sat down, the wood of the witness chair felt solid beneath me. Ash likely, strong, flexible, resilient. Ms. Peterson. Sterling began pacing in front of the stand. Please state your professional credentials for the court. I am a certified master arborist with the International Society of Arboriculture. I stated clearly, my voice projecting to the back of the room. I hold a degree in forestry management from the University of Washington. I specialize in risk assessment and structural integrity of old-growth hardwoods. Impressive, Sterling said, smiling at the jury box, though this was a bench trial with only the judge deciding. So, you know a sick tree when you see one. I do. And you inspected the stump of the tree in question. The oak tree removed from the property line between the Peterson and Gable residences. I did, I replied. I performed a full resistograph inspection and took macrocellular images of the heartwood. Excellent. Sterling leaned in, resting his hand on the railing of the witness stand. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial, sorrowful tone. In your professional opinion, Ms. Peterson, was that tree a hazard? Was it as your brother feared rotting from the inside out, posing an imminent threat to life and property? The room went silent. This was the moment, the golden question. My mother leaned forward. Kyle stopped slouching. Mrs. Gable looked down at her hands, resigning herself to defeat. I looked at my parents. I saw the entitlement etched into their faces, the absolute certainty that they could destroy something beautiful and simply talk their way out of the consequences. Then I looked at Mrs. Gable, who was mourning a tree as if it were a friend. I turned to Judge Holloway. No, I said. The silence in the room changed frequency. It went from expectant to stunned. Sterling froze. His smile faltered. I'm sorry. Perhaps you didn't understand the question. I asked if the tree was hazardous. I understood perfectly, I said, my voice gaining strength, rooting itself in the facts. The tree was a Quercus alba, a white oak. Based on the growth ring analysis I conducted, it was 108 years old. It was in peak biological health. There was no rot, no decay, no structural compromise. It was not a hazard. It was a perfect specimen. Objection? Sterling barked, panicked, losing his cool. Hostile witness. Overruled, Judge Holloway said, leaning over the bench, his eyes locked on me. She's your witness, counselor. Continue, Ms. Peterson. I reached into my bag and pulled out a clear evidence bag containing a fresh core sample, one I had gone back to collect at 4:00 a.m. that morning, knowing my parents would have disposed of the one I left on the kitchen table. This is a core sample from the stump, I said, holding it up. The cylinder of wood was pale tan, smooth, and flawlessly solid. White oak is unique because of its cellular structure. It produces structures called tyloses, which plug the vascular vessels of the heartwood. This makes the wood watertight and incredibly resistant to rot. That is why white oak is used to make wine barrels and ships. It doesn't rot easily. This sample shows dense, tight growth rings. This tree lived through the Dust Bowl. It lived through 2 world wars. It was anchoring the soil and providing habitat for over a century. It was cut down in its prime. My father stood up, his face purple. Rose, what are you doing? Sit down, sir, the bailiff barked, stepping forward. She's lying, my mother shrieked, her composure shattering. She's doing this to spite us. Order. Judge Holloway slammed his gavel, the sound cracking like a rifle shot. One more outburst from the defense table and I will hold you in contempt. Ms. Peterson, continue. You are saying the tree was healthy. It was perfectly healthy, Your Honor, I said, looking directly at the judge. I also measured the diameter. It was 52 inches at breast height. A tree of that species, size, and condition in this market has a replacement value far exceeding the $50,000 requested. But the biology is only half the story. I took a breath. This was the part that would sever the family tie permanently. I spoke with the defendants, my parents and my brother, immediately after my inspection. I testified. I showed them the proof that the tree was healthy. I explained that it was not a hazard. They explicitly asked me to perjure myself. They asked me to fabricate a report stating it was diseased to avoid liability. They knew it wasn't sick. They cut it down because it blocked the sun on their pool deck. Sterling slumped into his chair, burying his face in his hands. He knew it was over. Kyle's mouth was hanging open, his arrogance evaporating into terrifying realization. Judge Holloway's expression darkened. He turned his gaze slowly from me to my parents. It was a look of pure judicial disgust. He scribbled furiously on his notepad for a moment, then looked up. I've heard enough, the judge said. Does the plaintiff have any further questions? Mrs. Gable's lawyer, looking as stunned as everyone else, slowly stood up. No, Your Honor, the plaintiff rests. Mr. Sterling, the judge asked. Sterling waved a hand weakly. The defense rests, Your Honor. Judge Holloway set his pen down. He folded his hands. In cases of timber trespass, the law is very specific. Trees are not just property. They are long-term assets. They provide shade drainage, air quality, and aesthetic value. To remove a neighbor's tree is a trespass. To remove a 100-year-old oak is a tragedy. He looked at my father. Mr. Peterson, you claim the tree was a hazard. Your own expert witness, your own daughter, has proven that was a lie. You didn't cut it for safety. You cut it for convenience. And you tried to manipulate the court to cover it up. The judge picked up a statute book. In this state, when a timber trespass is found to be casual or involuntary, meaning an accident, the damages are simply the value of the tree. But when the trespass is found to be willful and malicious, meaning you knew what you were doing and did it anyway, the law allows for treble damages. Treble, my mother whispered, clutching my father's arm. Triple, Judge Holloway clarified, his voice hard as granite. The plaintiff asked for $50,000, which is a fair valuation for a mature white oak of this size. Because the testimony of Ms. Peterson proves that the defendants acted with willful intent and malicious disregard for the plaintiff's property rights, I'm invoking the treble damages statute. He raised the gavel. Judgment for the plaintiff in the amount of $150,000, Holloway declared, plus all legal fees incurred by Mrs. Gable. And Mr. Peterson, if you ever touch a tree on Mrs. Gable's property again, I will have you arrested. The gavel came down with a final resonant thud. The sound echoed in the silence. $150,000. It was a staggering sum. It was enough to wipe out their savings. It was enough to force the sale of assets. It was the financial equivalent of a clear cut. I sat in the witness box watching the color drain from my parents' faces. Kyle looked like he was going to be sick. Mrs. Gable was weeping softly, not with joy, but with the relief of vindication. I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my chest. I had just cost my family a fortune. I had just humiliated them in public. But as I looked at the grain of the witness stand railing, I felt something else too. I felt clean. The rot had been exposed. Now finally the healing could begin. The heavy double doors of the courtroom swung shut behind us, muting the buzz of the gallery, but the silence in the hallway was short-lived and volatile. It was the kind of silence that precedes a thunderclap. My father was the first to break it. He spun around his face, a mottled map of red fury and disbelief, his hands trembling as he adjusted his tie. But before he could speak, Kyle exploded. Are you insane? He screamed, his voice cracking and echoing off the marble floors of the courthouse corridor. He threw his hands up, pacing in a tight, frantic circle. $150,000. You just cost us $150,000. What is wrong with you? You were supposed to fix it. You were supposed to be the expert. He lunged toward me, not to strike, but to intimidate, encroaching on my personal space with the frantic energy of a trapped animal. You ruined everything, Rose, everything. I stood my ground, my back against the cool plaster wall. I didn't flinch. For years, Kyle's tantrums had been the wind that bent the family sapling, forcing everyone else to grow crooked just to accommodate him. But I wasn't a sapling anymore. I was hardwood. I didn't cost you a dime, Kyle, I said, my voice steady and low, cutting through his hysteria. You cost yourself that money when you decided your desire for a tan was more important than property law. I just told the truth. There's a difference. The truth, my mother hissed, stepping forward. She looked aged, the stress of the verdict pulling at her features. Since when does the truth matter? More than family? We are your parents, Rose. We raised you. We supported you. And you humiliate us in front of the whole town. You side with that woman over us. She wiped a tear from her cheek, but it was a tear of self-pity, not remorse. How could you be so cruel? Cruel. I laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. Let's talk about cruel, Mom. Let's talk about 5 years ago. They stopped blinking in confusion. The reference didn't land immediately. They had likely deleted the memory to make space for more of Kyle's needs. My graduation, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I sat in that gymnasium for 3 hours waiting for you. I walked across the stage and looked for you in the crowd. You weren't there. And why? Because Kyle dropped a tree on a fence. I looked at my brother, who was now leaning against the wall, sulking. You skipped the proudest moment of my life to clean up his mess. You showed me then exactly where I stood in this forest. I was the understory. He was the canopy. You let him block out my light for my entire life. My father looked away, his jaw working. My mother opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off. I learned a lot about trees in school. I continued, my voice gaining a rhythmic lecture-like cadence. I learned that when a tree has a limb that is diseased, sucking resources from the main trunk without contributing to photosynthesis, you have to cut it off. If you don't, the rot spreads. It infects the heartwood. It kills the whole organism. I gestured to Kyle. He is the dead limb dad, and you've been watering the rot for 30 years. That's enough. My father said, his voice gruff but lacking its usual fire. He looked tired. He looked at Mr. Sterling, who had quietly exited the courtroom via a side door, clearly realizing his billable hours were the only victory he was getting today. It is enough, I agreed. That's why I did it. I didn't fine you. I just refused to let you rot me too. I'm done lying for this family. I'm done being the fix-it girl for Kyle's disasters. The reality of the situation began to settle in like a heavy frost. My father pulled out his phone, opening his banking app, his fingers clumsy. 150,000, he muttered, plus legal fees. We're looking at nearly $200,000 liquid. He looked up at my mother, his face pale. We don't have it, Martha. Not in cash. The market is down. If we sell the stocks now, we take a massive loss. So what do we do? My mother asked, her voice trembling. We can't take a loan against the house. The interest rates are too high. My father looked at Kyle, then at the floor. He took a deep breath, the kind a man takes before he has to shoot a lame horse. The lake house, he said. Kyle's head snapped up. What? No, you can't sell the lake house? That's my place. I have guys coming down for Labor Day. I have the jet skis there. It's the only asset with enough equity to cover the judgment quickly. My father said, his voice hardening. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking at Kyle with adoration. He was looking at him with calculation. You heard the judge. We have to pay Mrs. Gable. We have to pay Sterling. The lake house goes on the market tomorrow. You can't do that, Kyle screamed, turning on me again. This is your fault. You're making them sell my house. It's not your house, Kyle, I said coldly. It's Mom and Dad's house. You just crashed there. And maybe now, without a free vacation home and a bottomless allowance, you'll actually have to get a job. He will, my father said. The words hung in the air, surprising everyone, including my father. He looked at Kyle. The allowance fund is gone, son. It's going to Mrs. Gable. You're nearly 30. It's time you learned how to handle a saw without dropping it on a fence. Kyle looked at them betrayed, then stormed off down the hallway, his footsteps echoing like the tantrums of a toddler, stripping away the last of his dignity. My parents stood there defeated. They looked smaller. The invincible facade of the Peterson family had been chipped away, exposing the ordinary flawed wood beneath. I'm going, I said. I have a long drive back. Rose, my mother said, reaching out a hand but dropping it before she touched me. Will you come for Thanksgiving? I don't know, I said honestly. Let's see how the pruning heals first. I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. I walked out of the courthouse and into the blinding brightness of the afternoon sun. The air tasted sweet. I drove back to the neighborhood, but I didn't pull into my parents' driveway. I pulled into the driveway next door. Mrs. Gable was sitting on her porch swing, a porcelain teacup in her hand. She was looking at the spot where the oak used to be used. The stump was still there, a flat, sad disc in the grass, but the sun was hitting the porch now, harsh and unfiltered. I walked up the steps. She looked up, and a smile broke across her face, genuine, warm, and grateful. "Rose," she said, "I didn't think you'd stop." "I wanted to check on you," I said, sitting in the wicker chair opposite her. "I made chamomile," she said, pouring a second cup from a floral pot. "To settle the nerves. Mine are still rattling like a loose shutter." She handed me the cup. Her hands were steady now. "You were wonderful in there, dear. Strong. Like your grandmother. She was a tough woman, too." "I just stated the facts," I said, taking a sip. The tea was hot and floral, grounding me. Mrs. Gable reached into her pocket and pulled out a checkbook. "Rose, I want to give you something. I know your parents. I know this will cause a rift. And the legal fees for your travel. I want to give you a portion of the settlement. It's only right. You won this for me." I reached out and gently closed her checkbook. "No, Mrs. Gable." "But, no," I insisted softly. "I didn't do it for the money. If I take a dime from you, it validates everything they think about me, that I'm vindictive or greedy. I did it for the tree, and I did it for you." She looked at me, her eyes wet. "It feels empty," she said, gesturing to the yard. "The money, it doesn't bring back the shade. It doesn't bring back the sound of the wind in the leaves." "No," I admitted, looking at the stump. "It doesn't. You can't buy 100 years of growth, but you can buy justice, and you can buy the future." "The future?" she asked. "Use the money," I said. "Fix your roof, visit your grandkids, buy the most expensive, beautiful plants you can find, turn this yard into a sanctuary that they can't touch. That's how you win. You grow." She nodded slowly, taking a sip of her tea. We sat in silence for a long time, watching a cardinal land on the raw wood of the stump. It pecked at the bark, looking for insects, then flew off in a flash of red. "The tree is gone," Mrs. Gable whispered, echoing my thoughts. "But the truth stands. That's better." "It is," I said. "The truth has deep roots. It holds the soil together when the storm comes." I finished my tea and stood up. I had a 6-hour drive back to the mountains, back to the Douglas firs, and the silence of the canopy. But for the first time in 5 years, I didn't feel like I was running away. I felt like I was returning to my own soil. I hugged Mrs. Gable, smelling the lavender soap she always used, and walked back to my truck. As I drove away, I saw the for sale sign being hammered into the lawn of the lake house across town in my mind's eye. It was a painful correction, a harsh pruning, but it was the only way to save the tree. And for the first time, I had hope that maybe, just maybe, the Peterson family might survive the winter. The seasons in the Pacific Northwest changed with a subtle damp shift in the air. But back in my hometown, autumn was a declarative sentence. The maples were shouting in vibrant reds and oranges, and the air carried the distinct smoky scent of decaying leaves returning to the earth to feed the next generation. It had been 6 months since the gavel fell in Judge Holloway's courtroom. 6 months of radio silence broken only by a stiff, formal invitation from my mother to attend Thanksgiving dinner. I had debated ignoring it. I had debated staying in my fire lookout tower and eating canned soup while watching the mist roll over the Cascades. But trees don't heal by avoiding the wound. They heal by growing over it layer by layer until the scar becomes part of the support structure. So I drove south. I pulled into the driveway just as the sun was beginning its early descent. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Usually, Thanksgiving at the Peterson house was a production cars lining the street, music blaring from the backyard, Kyle holding court with his friends, while my mother ran herself ragged trying to impress people she didn't even like. Today, the driveway was empty, except for my parents' sedan. The lake house boat trailer that used to take up half the garage was gone, sold along with the property to satisfy the judgment. The absence of that trailer felt like a breath of fresh air. The house looked smaller, without the clutter of their ego surrounding it. My mother met me at the door. She looked different. The frantic, high-strung energy that usually vibrated off her was gone, replaced by a subdued, weary calmness. She was wearing an apron, not her usual cocktail dress. "Rose," she said, and for the first time in years, she didn't criticize my boots or my hair. She just stepped forward and hugged me. It was a tentative hug, fragile like she was afraid I might snap if she squeezed too hard. I'm glad you came. Happy Thanksgiving, Mom, I said, stepping inside. The house smelled of roasted turkey and sage, a traditional scent that felt grounding. I walked into the living room, bracing myself for Kyle's commentary, but the room was empty. My father was sitting in his armchair reading a paperback book instead of watching football on the massive TV that used to dominate the room. He looked up, removing his reading glasses. He seemed older. The bluster, the booming voice that commanded rooms had softened. Where's Kyle? I asked, looking around. Working, my father said, setting his book down. He got a job at the hardware supply center over in Westbury. He's working the holiday shift for time and a half. I blinked, genuinely stunned. Kyle is working manual labor. He didn't have much choice, my father said, standing up. There was no bitterness in his voice, only a resigned acceptance. Once the lake house was sold and the settlement paid, the bank of Dad closed its doors. He's learning the value of $1. It's been good for him. He's tired, but he's less angry. He walked over to me, and for a moment I thought he was going to scold me to rehash the trial. Instead, he gestured toward the back patio doors. Walk with me. We stepped out onto the deck, the same deck that had started this entire war. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the yard. The stump was still there in the neighbor's yard, a gray monument to the past. But the anger associated with it seemed to have leached away into the soil. I was angry at you for a long time, my father admitted, leaning against the railing. He didn't look at me. He looked at the tree line. I thought you were ungrateful. I thought you were trying to hurt us. I was trying to stop you, I corrected him gently. I know, he sighed. He turned to face me, his eyes clear. I watched you on that stand, Rose. I listened to you talk about growth rings and tyloses and timber statutes. You commanded that room. You weren't just my daughter. You were an expert, a professional. He paused, swallowing hard. I realized something that day. We missed your graduation to help Kyle with a fence. We missed seeing you become the person who could sit in that witness chair and take us apart with facts. I never respected your work because I never took the time to understand it. I'm sorry. It wasn't a groveling apology, but it was an honest one. It was the first time my father had ever looked at me and seen an equal rather than a subordinate. Thank you, I said, my throat tight. That means a lot. Dinner was quiet. There were no arguments, no posturing about stocks or vacations. We just ate, talked about the weather, and discussed Kyle's new job. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. The scar tissue was still there, thick and knotty, but the rot was gone. The toxic entitlement that had threatened to topple the family had been pruned away, leaving something smaller but healthier in its place. The next morning, the air was crisp and cold, the ground covered in a glittering layer of frost. I woke up early and went to the garage. I had brought something with me from the nursery up north. I hauled the burlap-wrapped root ball out to the driveway. My parents came out, coffee mugs in hand, watching me. What's that? My mother asked. A peace offering, I said. Grab a shovel. We walked next door. Mrs. Gable was already awake, sweeping her porch. When she saw us, me carrying the sapling, my father carrying a shovel, and my mother holding a watering can, she stopped. A smile, bright and youthful, transformed her face. We went to the spot where the old oak had stood. The stump was too hard to remove without heavy machinery, so we chose a spot 10 feet away, giving the new life its own space. My father dug the hole, sweating in the morning chill, working harder than I had seen him work in years. My mother mixed the compost. Mrs. Gable supervised, pointing out exactly where the light would hit best in June. We lowered the tree into the earth. It was a Quercus macrocarpa, a bur oak. It was slow-growing, rugged, and capable of living for 300 years. It looks so small, my mother remarked, looking at the slender whip of a trunk. It is, I said, breaking up the soil around the base. But its roots will go deep. It's an investment. My father patted the soil down with his boot, then looked at Mrs. Gable. I'm sorry about your view, Martha, or the lack thereof. I like this view better. Mrs. Gable said, looking at the three of us standing together, dirt on our hands. I took the watering can from my mother and soaked the earth, sealing the air pockets, ensuring the roots made contact with their new home. We stood there for a long moment. Four people, bound by a lawsuit, and a loss, now bound by a new life. The sapling wouldn't cast shade for another 20 years. None of the older adults standing there would likely live to see it reach its full majesty. But that wasn't the point. We weren't planting it for us. We were planting it for the future. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, I said, patting the soil down around the roots, feeling the cold, damp promise of the earth against my palm. The second best time is now. Sometimes standing tall requires pruning the very roots that raised you. Rose's journey proves that integrity is the only legacy that truly lasts. If you enjoyed this story of legal justice and family renewal, please consider subscribing to the channel for more. What would you have done in her position? Let us know down below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Radiance. We'll see you next time.